There's an old Earth saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And I'm not just talking about trees. Greetings, loyal members, and welcome to this Dominion War special episode. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Dominion battleships, and we're going to be looking at the various fates which befell them by the end of the war. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it. So, it's fair to say that the Dominion battleship is a pretty key part of the Dominion War, if not in its strategic impact, then as a demonstration of the Dominion's technological prowess, and also how Dominion doctrine and thinking was developing during the course of the war. So, of course, many of you will have seen the Battle of the Giants, if you wish to refresh yourself, but essentially the Dominion knew going into the Alpha Quadrant, where you had established major powers, that its pre-existing force of cruisers and attack ships was simply not going to be sufficient against the most powerful enemy vessels, and certainly not against enemy fortifications. Again, you think about the large Starfleet bases that are in use by the late 24th century. You're not going to break through their shields with battle cruisers alone. So already before the war began, the Dominion was working on battleship designs. While the Dominion was never able to get battleships from the Gamma Quadrant to the Alpha Quadrant, they did of course bring the designs with them, and after the closure of the wormhole, began developing in-house in the Alpha Quadrant. This process was further hastened when the Romulans joined the war in late 2374. Of course, the Romulans primarily operating a fleet of large battleships, so the Dominion's need for their own battleship became ever more critical. So in total, by the end of 2374, there are 7 Dominion battleships launched from yards across Dominion territory. This is using both Cardassian but also some captured Federation yards. And the plan going forward would be to produce 7 per year. The Dominion has an incredible ability to produce ships at scale very, very quickly. Unfortunately, when it came to 2375, that year's production was substantially impeded by a number of factors. For one, the Monac shipyards were utterly destroyed by a Klingon raid. The Omekla shipyards would be devastated in December by the Romulan Firebirds, and the Federation shipyards at Iadara were recaptured in July of 2375, so that by the end of the year, in total, only 4 additional Dominion battleships have been built. In total, the Dominion had 11 battleships by the end of 2375. In total, by war's end, 3 would be lost. One was lost at the Battle of Catula. Another was lost during the second retreat after the Breen counteroffensive. The final battleship that was lost during the war was lost during the Battle of Cardassia. So in total, only 8 Dominion battleships survived the war. So when we look at the Dominion War, where you're going to be losing dozens of D-Duradexes and Galaxy classes and Jem'hadar battle cruisers, which, don't forget, are still on the same scale as other capital ships, then why was the Dominion battleship so survivable? Well, for one, the thing was bloody tough. The thing was armoured with a neutronium composite. It was very, very tough. It could take direct torpedo hits to the hull and shake them off like it was nothing. Another benefit that the Dominion battleship had, and in fact all Dominion ships have this benefit, but the battleships really enjoyed it the most because they're such conspicuous targets, is that they're actually very hard to identify. I don't mean that it's hard to spot a Dominion battleship. It's not. It's flipping huge. It's not exactly subtle. But what I mean is that it's very difficult to identify individual battleships and track them. This, of course, is owed to how the Dominion builds ships. They print them out. They are basically virtually identical. So it is impossible to actually distinguish individuals of a class from one another. It's very, very difficult to do that. Why is that significant? Because if you are undertaking an operation to track down and destroy these ships, then it is very important to be able to actually identify them. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to get an accurate information space. You're never going to get an accurate picture of where the different battleships are and what they're doing. So what it boils down to is you end up having to recognize patterns, but it's difficult to establish a pattern when you can't even establish who the individuals are. Another benefit that the Dominion battleship had is that it was rarely used, which you might say is a little bit of a cheat. It's a little bit like Napoleon's old guard being called the Immortals, and given all this reputation, when in reality it was that they were rarely deployed and that they were almost never deployed against a steady enemy. By the time Napoleon was deploying his old guard, it was generally that he just needed one last blow to break through. And, they almost fought on reputation alone. And this became evident when, at the Battle of Waterloo, Wellington has a reserve ready of still steady troops, and that was enough to break the old guard. Additionally, when they are deployed, they are always supported. Each battleship is accompanied by its own flotilla of Jem'hadar attack ships, not to mention neighbouring formations of battle cruisers and Dominion battle groups, and they're deployed in force. You won't just deploy one battleship to a combat zone, you'll probably deploy at least 2, possibly 4. In which case, it's even harder to destroy them because they can protect one another, they can provide mutual support. Much like in the Katinga video, I mentioned how formation is very, very important in allowing greater survivability, and it's true, and this is certainly the case with the Dominion battleship. Finally, the main thing that is in the Dominion battleship's favour is that it was almost always used in the offence. When the Dominion has initiative, when the Dominion is dictating the pace of engagement, when the Dominion is in control of the battle space, and it can move at its own pace, and is not at risk of being overrun by the enemy. So you put all these factors together, well, it's no blinking wonder that so many of them survived when the Dominion were so cautious with how they employed them, because of course they're a considerable investment. I mean, think of all that you could have built if you hadn't built Jem'hadar battleships. Of course, that factors into the other side of that, which is that because you built something so flipping expensive, you're so reluctant to risk it. And so you end up then losing an awful lot of opportunity where you wouldn't have hesitated to just throw out 100 Jem'hadar fighters at a target. You are going to hesitate to throw one Jem'hadar battleship at a target. So that's why the majority of Jem'hadar battleships survived. But why did those 3 individuals I mentioned earlier, why were they destroyed? Well, let's go through it on a case-by-case basis. Subject number 1, the Battle of Catula. So, the Battle of Catula is part of Tomalok's counter-offensive on the Benzar front, sometimes known as Tomalok's Phalanx or Tomalok's Steamroller. The Romulans and allies were just surging forward and were able to always outmatch Dominion fleets with joint fleets operating together. In this particular instance at Catula, this was Tomalok's own Black Legion deploying alongside the Kahless Chosen Klingon fleet. So, what happens? Well, the Klingons engage first, and they engage the Jem'hadar battle groups. Now, the Klingons like to fight in what we would call open order. Essentially, that's going to be, rather than fighting as one big fleet, they break off into generally 4 brigades. Each brigade is its own mini fleet with its own light element, medium element, and heavy element. And they then fight their own little micro engagements where they can best exploit their own mobility and firepower and initiative. The Dominion learned a long time ago that their best defense against this kind of strategy was to fight in close order. So concentrate their ships together, form a death ball, and then one by one obliterate each of those separate brigades. However, with the Romulans also being present, this wasn't possible. You see, at any point that the Dominion tried to form close order, the Diduridexes started to decloak, and for a Diduridex, a close order formation of lots of ships relatively close together at relatively close range is just a beautiful target as far as they're concerned. And you'd get Diduridex and you'll get Diduridex Cortaris just completely circling whole Dominion battle groups or divisions and wiping them out very easily. So by doing this, the Allies forced the Dominion into an open order battle, and the Klingons are able to fight as they would wish. All the while, Tomalok's Raptor formation is keeping any Dominion ships from reinforcing the Jem'hadar battleship. The Jem'hadar battleship is deployed on its own, and it's isolated, and their job is to just keep it isolated. It's not to engage the battleship itself, but it's to stop any other Jem'hadar units coming to reinforce that. So they basically just wiped out the entire enemy fleet, kept the battleship isolated and out the fight because it was too slow to get itself to the fight, and so then they just surrounded it and began ganking it with Vochars and Raptors. Now here is where we get a spot of controversy. While the Allies would claim that they destroyed this battleship, the Dominion claims that they scuttled it. It's a point of controversy and nothing more really than pride. I mean, you lost a battleship and that's the main thing. Whether it's because you blew it up because it was in an impossible position does not get away from the fact that it was in that position in the first place. It's like the whole Bismarck scuttling debate. It's somewhat pointless and missing the main problem with the system. So, that was what happened with the first Dominion battleship lost at the Battle of Catula. The next one, as I said, broke down during the Dominion retreat of 2376, after the Founder orders a rapid retreat back into Cardassian space after it's discovered that the Federation have adapted to the Breen energy damper. Rather than wait for the inevitable Starfleet counteroffensive, the Dominion decide they're just going to pull back into a more defensible position and dare the Allies to come and get them. However, as Dominion forces retreated, one of the battleships travelling along the central front, that's roughly between the McAllister Nebula and the Badlands, as it was moving through there, it suffered engine problems. Its main warp coils burned out. Now, it remained at warp, it wasn't completely dead in the water. All Dominion ships have secondary warp engines. The problem being is that, unlike on the battlecruiser, where you can actually do pretty well on the secondary warp engines, on the Dominion battlecruiser that can actually keep it at a good cruising speed, the auxiliary engines on the battleship were not nearly enough to keep pace with the rest of the Dominion fleet, and so it was inevitably left behind. And when they realised that the Allies were hot on their heels, the crew scuttled it. The thing was too bloody tough for its own good and couldn't actually be effectively scuttled, and so going into the final phase of the war, with the invasion of Cardassia, for reals this time, the Allies now had a lot of intelligence on this battleship and how it worked and how to kill it. This brings us then to the final battleship lost during the war, and this is at the Battle of Cardassia itself. In total, there are 5 Dominion battleships present. I will do a separate special episode explaining the Battle of Cardassia, but suffice it to say, you had a main line of ships deployed, engaging in a very large battle in deep space, and the battleships were actually deployed to the rear. They were basically hanging back behind the line and waiting for somebody to try and break through. When they did break through, absolutely pummel them with torpedoes and their siege guns, and basically stop any kind of breakthrough from escalating, and that helped keep Dominion lines relatively solid. Deployed alongside these Jem'hadar battleships was also the Nasat, that is a Hutet class, one of the second-run Hutet class ships, and actually it was under the command of Legate Sobrag of great infamy. So, battle's going on, Dominion battleships are holding back and are just firing on anyone who breaks through, giving them a bloody nose, and keeping things very stable. Then suddenly, for some reason, the Dominion lines begin to disintegrate. Next thing they know, the Nasat has rounded on them and has come into arc to fire its super firing battery and just absolutely unloaded a full alpha strike into the side of the battleship. Now, the Dominion, understandably a little bit miffed at the Cardassians turning on them, very quickly turned their attention to the Nasat and obliterated it with a couple of torpedo volleys. but it created an opening for the Allied ships, which were now pouring through the Dominion lines, and they were able to engage it with a mix of ships, mostly Klingon Watchers, Federation frigates, as well as a couple of Parliament-class battlecruisers, were able to eventually bring the ship down, and that was definitively destroyed by enemy fire. It arguably shook Dominion morale, and they retreated to Cardassia Prime itself to make their final stand, then relying on the orbital defense platforms to augment their depleted strength. So, what does all this tell us about Dominion battleships and how you beat them? Well, there's a couple of things, and I'm going to call this method MYTH. Shut up, I want an acronym. M is for mismatch. Don't try to fight Dominion battleships with your own battleships. They're inevitably going to die. It's just not a fight that's worth committing your battleships. Your battleships are best used engaging weaker enemy ships and just obliterating them, and creating the opening then for other ships to then go and attack the battleship. Anything with heavy disruptor cannons and quantum torpedoes is going to be of great use against a Dominion battleship. The heavy disruptors are of course a great alpha. You can just fire them and then get out of dodge, and quantum torpedoes are very, very effective at large targets. That is really what the quantum torpedo is made to deal with, and so those are very, very good weapons against the Dominion battleship. So you mismatch. The other thing to do is isolate. You take away its support. It's not nearly as intimidating when it's out on its own. Now, as I mentioned previously, it's very difficult to break away the Dominion, the Jem'hadar fighters that are specifically attached to that battleship, and they are there specifically as close protection for that battleship. Those guys, you're going to have a trouble moving them. They are going to stay very close by, and they are not going to be easily baited. You can quite easily draw off the other enemy formations that may try to coalesce around the battleship. Ultimately, what you are exploiting is its lack of mobility, and it's going to find it very difficult to regroup if it is ever left on its own. And that comes down to the final point, which is F, which is force it to move. And I don't necessarily mean this in the tactical sense. Yes, it's big and it's slow, but that's not really the problem. The problem isn't that it's slow. The problem is that everyone else is flipping faster and gets a bit carried away. When I say force it to move, I'm more meaning in the strategic sense. This ship is not built for high-tempo operations. It is not built for a highly fluid battle space. It is built so that you basically say, there's a target, go blow it up. And just drive in a straight line, go to target, blow it up, move on. And that's really all that it is intended to do. So, if you create a chaotic, high-tempo battle space, well, okay, you might not be able to isolate it, but you will keep it out of the fight, because it is never going to be able to deploy effectively. So, in conclusion, what are the lessons that we can learn from the Jem'hadar battleship? Well, I think the first lesson to learn is that there is such a thing as overlearning your lessons. The Dominion battleship is built primarily as a response to the large battleships of the Alpha Quadrant, the Duridex, the Galaxy class, the Negh'var. And what the Dominion did in response to that was do their utmost to compete in the most phallus measuring fashion possible. It was designed to beat, to overwhelm Alpha Quadrant design. But unfortunately, by doing that, it was going to be no longer fit for the Dominion's own doctrine. It is an outlier within the realm of Dominion doctrine. The Dominion didn't adapt their doctrine. They just built a new ship and hoped it would work. The reality is that Dominion doctrine is basically incompatible with a kind of ship like this, because Dominion doctrine is ultimately fluidic. That is the nature of Dominion doctrine. That means that when they attack rapidly and swiftly everywhere at once. But also, the moment they come up against a resistance, they can flow around it, or they can just retreat. That is also within Dominion doctrine, is to just, if you come up against an enemy force that is just overwhelming and much more powerful than your own, you retreat, and you'll get them the next time. The Dominion are not thinking on a scale of months and years. They're thinking decades, centuries. That's the metric they're operating on. And so to the Dominion, retreat is a valid strategic option. But with something like a Dominion battleship, this thing can't retreat. This thing can only ever be used if you are going to maintain consistent forward momentum, because otherwise it's either going to get left behind or you're going to end up retreating and it's going to get isolated. So it becomes a much easier target for the enemy and much harder for you as the end user to actually use the damn thing. So, did the Jem'hadar battleship impact the war? Well, yeah, it did. It slowed down the war for the fleet least used to slowing down. As I said, Dominion doctrine is fluidic. This is not. I think ultimately what this demonstrates more than anything else is what was going on inside the heads of Dominion decision makers, because it's decisions like these that lost the Dominion the war. There's all sorts of setbacks that Dominion suffered, but it's not Damar's rebellion, and it's not losing the wormhole. It's things like this that made the Dominion lose the war. You take this and you apply that to other decisions made by the Dominion leadership, and I do mean the Dominion leadership, and it starts to build, as I say, a pattern. And when you see that pattern in action, it's no bloody wonder the Dominion lost the war. And no amount of overcompensating, over-armoured battleships are going to change that. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you all next time.